When we're building a custom subwoofer enclosure, a lot of times we're going to have 6 sides. But there are many different ways that we can assemble these different pieces together in order to make that box. As an example, let's look at this subwoofer mounting face, which we will call the baffle. Should that face be inset and surrounded by the top and bottom and the sides of the enclosure? Or should it be its own face like this with all the other pieces behind it? What about the sides of the box? Should they cap off the ends of the enclosure? Or should they be surrounded by the top, bottom, and front and back? The way that you end up choosing to assemble the enclosure is going to have a huge impact on the ease of construction of that enclosure and its final appearance. In this video, I want to show you my preference for building these custom subwoofer enclosures and explain why, so let's dive on in. Before we get started, I do want to thank our sponsor for this episode, New Concepts. New Concepts has a wide variety of wiring and power distribution gear that you can use for your car audio build. I recently did a multi-amplifier and DSP build here on the channel, and I used exclusively New Concepts wiring as their gear is a high quality at a great value. I find their distribution blocks very simple to use and configure for so many different systems. I've used New Concepts for a long time, long before I ever started the channel, so if you guys want to learn more about them and check them out for your next car audio build, do so at the link down in the video description. Let's start with talking about this, the baffle. So the baffle is the face that has the subwoofer mounted to it. So do keep in mind that it's not always going to necessarily be the front face that we're talking about here. We could have the subwoofer enclosure oriented this way here. It could be a sub up, port up style application, but I would still want my baffle to have these design characteristics that we're going to talk about. So right off the bat, I like to have the baffle be a full face with everything else behind it. In other words, this would be an example of what I do not like. In this case, you can see here's the baffle and it's surrounded by other pieces. There's a lot of reasons that I like this style a lot better. So a lot of times when you build a custom subwoofer enclosure, the face that has the subwoofer mounted on it is likely going to be an exposed face that you're going to see when you're viewing the enclosure. So the first reason that I like to have that face go all the way to the outside edges of our enclosure is because it gives it a much more clean look. Imagine we built this custom subwoofer enclosure here and we go to wrap it with carpet or vinyl. We're going to have a nice, perfectly flat face that we're not going to need to do any additional body work on. Now, making a comparison here, since this face is surrounded by other pieces, you can imagine that there's going to be a slight imprecision in a seam between these two. Unless we do absolutely perfect woodworking, or if we spend a bunch of extra time sanding these pieces flush together to make sure that they're perfect, maybe even adding a little bit of body filler between these two different pieces. That's a lot of extra work we have to do to get that perfectly flat face when we could have just planned our enclosure to have this face be all the way to the outer limits of the box. Another reason I like constructing the enclosures like this is a lot of times we'll add a roundover around the outside edge of that exposed face using a roundover bit on the router. So when we construct our enclosure like this, it's very easy to run that roundover around the outside of the box and get that nice finished look. Unfortunately though, if you build your enclosure like this, oftentimes we don't get the same result when we're running a roundover around that outside edge. And the reason is a lot of times these two faces here don't end up being perfectly on the same plane. So as you run that bearing of the roundover bit from this edge over to this edge, it might go down slightly or stay up slightly higher. And I find that you just don't get that perfect roundover shape. Now, of course, yes, again, you could make sure that you get these cuts absolutely perfect. You could also make sure that you spend a bunch of time sanding. You could sand out that little ripple in the roundover, but these are all things that take extra time when you could have just made the enclosure like this. Now on ported enclosures, I always like to make sure that I also have a roundover around the port opening. This is for obvious reasons. You want that port airflow to be nice and smooth as it goes around that edge. When we plan out our baffle in this way out of one constant piece of material, it's again very easy to run a roundover on the inside of that port cutout. Whereas when we're doing this style here, we don't end up with that perfect look because we have multiple different pieces that have to be perfectly lined up. And even then, when you have a corner like this, the bit can't get the bearing all the way into the corner, so you kind of end up with a weird rounded look in here. But when we plan our baffle this way with the hole cut out, we could leave small radiuses in each corner. That way we're going to have a nice flowing round over as we go around and make that cutting pass on the router. Now here is another huge benefit of planning our enclosure in this way. So right now I have a dimension taken from outside to outside, and you can see that that's 30 inches. So if you think about it, when we plan out our box like this, check this out. How many pieces have that same 30-inch dimension? Well, both of the front baffles do. They're both 30 inches wide. And oh, check that out. The top of the enclosure is also 30 inches wide. The back of the enclosure, 30 inches wide. And the bottom of the enclosure, 30 inches wide. So that's 5 different pieces that all have that same dimension. When you're working with sheet goods on a table saw or even a handheld circular saw, having a bunch of common dimensions for pieces is huge. That's because when I go to cut these 5 pieces, I can make one cut that has all of that 30-inch dimension, and then off that large board, I can cut this piece off of it first, and then I would cut this piece next, and so on for the rest of the pieces. Not only does this save a ton of time, it also makes all of those pieces the exact same length. As long as our cutting tools are accurate on something like a table saw, we're only setting the fence once to make that 30-inch cutting pass. So that whole board is going to be the exact same length. We're not moving the fence multiple times and making multiple different cuts. Another major benefit when it comes to laying out our subwoofer enclosure like this is when we go to flush mount the subwoofer. You can see the way our enclosure is designed is with a double baffle. It adds more strength to that face since we're removing a lot of the strength by having the cutout for the subwoofer on it. And by flush mounting onto this surface here, we just get a much more appealing look, and it allows that subwoofer to sit back a little bit more less exposed on the front face. Now here is where the issue comes up. Let's say that the outside diameter of our subwoofer is very close to the limited height that we have available for the subwoofer box. When we construct our enclosure in this way, it's not a big deal because really we could have this flush mount hole go pretty darn close to the outside edge. I've left as little as a 1/16 of an inch before because you don't have to worry about there being a whole bunch of strength in that area of the enclosure. It's more the strength of the 2 different layers being bonded together. When it comes to this layout style though, it doesn't work out the same. If you have that same height as what we used before and we need that same outer dimension size, this is actually a little bit smaller now. I'll make it as big as the other one so I can illustrate my point. You can see that just the way the boards are laid out, it doesn't work the same. Unless we were to somehow try to make some weird cut into this flat board here to add that extra clearance, I don't even know how you would really make that cut without doing some really crazy router work. The point is, if you have a subwoofer that has an OD that's close to what your allowed height is going to be, it just makes a ton more sense to use this layout style here. This will allow you to fit a larger subwoofer in a tighter area than if you went with this style. Next up here, we need to talk about end caps. This is a little bit different because if you think about it, we could lay out, the top and the front and the bottom this style here, but technically we could have the ends of the enclosure inset so that the top goes over it and the bottom goes under that cut area. But I do see this a lot where people kind of just cap off the ends of the enclosure. And there's a reason I like to avoid doing that as well. What I prefer is having the ends completely surrounded by the outer pieces. You can see that even though there's a port on this enclosure, so this is one piece here from that face to that face, and if we look at the other side of the enclosure, it's the same way. The side is completely surrounded by the other pieces. One reason that I really like to do this is for precision. So we're gonna focus on the port end of the box here. Let's say that we built this subwoofer enclosure. Sometimes what you can do, and this is a little trick, you can make all these pieces just a little bit longer than they need to be. If you remember earlier, we measured that this dimension here is 30 inches. I might cut this to like 30 1/4 and intentionally cut all the pieces a little bit oversized. And the reason for doing that would be when I go to mount this side piece, I would intentionally inset it slightly off of the ends. Now I'd have some math to do because I'd want to make sure that the enclosure ends up being 30 inches once I'm done. But the little trick you can do is by insetting this piece on the inside of everything else. Let's say that you inset it an 1/8 inch on each end of the enclosure. That makes up that 1/4 inch that we talked about. What you could then do is you could take the assembled subwoofer enclosure over to your router with a flush trim bit, and you could run the bearing along here on your first cutting pass, making this face here perfectly flush with the side. You would then flip the enclosure, something like that. So now the back of the enclosure is on your router table, and you would make the next cutting pass. So now you're gonna ride along here, making that cut perfectly flush to the side piece. By doing that little construction trick, you now have a perfectly flushed out face on the end of the box. If we go to our construction style that I don't really like, what you could do instead is you could oversize this piece, you would oversize the end intentionally, and then you could flush trim each part of the side until you get to the port. Then there becomes an issue, because when you go to flush trim this edge here, there's nothing for that bearing to ride against. The port is in the way. The other reason that I really like the end pieces to be completely surrounded by other parts is because we can do this cool little wrapping trick here. So imagine this is that side piece of the enclosure before we assemble everything. What we can do, and you guys have probably seen me do this a lot of times if you've watched my box builds here on the channel, we can add what's called a rabbited groove. So using a rabbiting bit on the router, we basically create this little step that goes around the outside of the piece. You'll see that step on all 4 sides. This makes it so that once we assemble the enclosure, you can see that we're basically going to have a little groove between, in this case, the top and the side piece. Same for the baffles there. There's a nice little groove that goes all the way around between each of the pieces. So the advantage of having this groove is it gives us the perfect spot to tuck our upholstery materials if we're wrapping this box. I can tuck the upholstery materials down into that groove, and it gives me a perfect guide edge to run my razor blade and get a nice, precise, perfect cut that really gives the ends of your enclosure a nice, perfect look. If we go to the other layout method, you can see that if we ran a rabbet around the outside edge, it really wouldn't offer any benefit, because it's not like you're wrapping, the outside material from these faces into it. It really wouldn't work right. You need it to be inset like we have here. Now, when we're building custom subwoofer enclosures, we also want the other important design features. I've got 45s on the inside of the port and inside the enclosure there. I also have bracing to keep the enclosure nice and strong. I have a port end brace to allow the air to really flow over the end. We always have that round over on the end there, as well as the inside of the port. So these are all features that are really important. But now you have an understanding why I really like this layout method. Now, obviously not every subwoofer enclosure out there is just a 6-sided enclosure. Sometimes they are more complex, but you can still apply a lot of the methods and ideas that we talked about in this video to a more complex enclosure, something like this. I have a couple other examples. You can see on this one, again, I've got the baffles completely flat, so it gives a nice appearance of that exposed face. I've got the side inset so that we can do that wrapping method that we talked about. On this enclosure, again, that exposed face is all flat. The subwoofers can easily extend all the way to the outside, even though they're close to that limited width in this case. And you can see that the side of the enclosure there, completely surrounded by everything else, again, for the upholstery tricks. And even a larger enclosure like this, got that same constant face there surrounding the port. We could add a round over to the port if needed, round the outside edges, the subwoofer cutout holes. You can see that we double layered everything in this case, but even with the double layers, the sides are inset. You can do that finishing method on the sides if need be. It just makes for a much better layout. I always love to hear from you guys. Next time you are laying out a subwoofer enclosure, do you think that you'll apply some of the stuff that you learned from this video, and is there anything else that we should add? Next time you need wiring and wiring accessories for a car audio build, definitely check out our show sponsor, New Concepts. A big thanks to them, along with Mike, Jerry, Mo, William, and the rest of the Patreon membership team. A big thanks to all those guys for making these videos possible. Thank you for tuning in and watching, and I'll see you in the next one.